I still remember the first time I noticed something was wrong, not because it was obvious, but because it wasn't. It was subtle, almost polite at first, like the land itself was trying not to accuse anyone too early. My name is Nathan Cole, and for most of my life I've taken care of a 15-acre organic apple orchard sitting in the lower valley of Ridge Hollow. Nothing glamorous, just rows of trees my family has tended since the late 1980s, back when this land was still quiet enough that you could hear the wind move through the branches without anything else competing for attention. We went organic more than 20 years ago, and I don't say that like it was a branding decision. It wasn't. It was years of soil testing, failed inspections, waiting periods, and a level of patience that only makes sense if you've ever had to rebuild something from the ground up and hope it stays stable long enough to matter. That certification became everything for us, not just income, but identity. Because when you sell organic produce, you're not just selling fruit. You're selling trust in something people assume is stable, and stability in farming is a fragile thing. It only takes one incident to undo decades. We supplied local markets, a few small restaurants in the nearby town, and my mother still insisted on keeping a small roadside stand open even when it barely made sense financially, because she liked talking to people more than she liked counting what they bought. And I think that said more about our relationship with the land than anything else ever could. Things were steady for years, predictable in the way farms are when nothing interferes, until the ridge property above us was sold. And that was the moment everything quietly started shifting. The new owner was a man named Adrian Vance, crypto wealth, tech money, one of those sudden fortunes that arrives fast and builds even faster. And he didn't just buy land. He reshaped it, clearing the ridge in ways that made it feel like the mountain had been edited rather than inhabited. I first saw the construction site early one morning when I went up to check a boundary fence, and I remember standing there watching heavy machinery carve into the slope like it was nothing more than a design surface. And above it all, taking shape slowly, was a massive modern glass structure that looked more like an exhibition piece than a home. And then I saw the pool. An infinity pool cut right along the edge of the ridge, designed in a way that made the horizon look like part of the architecture. And at the time I remember thinking it was impressive in a way that had nothing to do with practicality, more like something built to be photographed rather than lived in. The architect, a man named Elliot Brand, came down to the fence line one afternoon while I was inspecting irrigation lines, and he spoke like someone describing geometry rather than water movement, talking about slope integration, natural runoff, and compliance standards. And I asked him a simple question. I said, "Where does overflow actually go when it rains hard?" And he smiled like I had asked something too basic to worry about, and said, "It follows grade, fully approved, no impact downstream." Adrian Vance showed up shortly after that, dressed casually, like none of this required much thought from him. And he looked at me the way people sometimes do when they assume concern is just unfamiliarity with progress. And he said, "We're building something world-class here. It's engineered properly. You don't need to worry about what happens below." I remember laughing a little, not because it was funny, but because it was easier than explaining how soil actually works to someone who believed approval meant safety. And I told him, calmly, that chlorine doesn't care about permits, it cares about biology, and if runoff reaches my orchard it doesn't matter what county paperwork says, it matters what it does to the soil. He shrugged and said something I never forgot. "If it becomes an issue, I'm sure the system can handle it." And in that moment I realized we weren't even speaking from the same understanding of what an issue meant. I went back down to the orchard that evening and walked the rows longer than I usually do, checking moisture levels, checking irrigation flow, trying to convince myself I was overthinking it, because on paper everything above me was legal, approved, inspected, signed off. But land doesn't operate on paperwork, it operates on movement, gravity, and accumulation over time. Construction continued through spring and into summer, and from a distance the house started to take shape as something almost beautiful in a cold, architectural sense. Glass reflecting sky, steel edges clean and deliberate, and the pool sitting at the ridge like it belonged to a different world entirely, one that didn't consider what existed below it. The first real sign didn't come from noise or damage. It came after a heavy rain, when I noticed the lower section of the orchard staying wet longer than it should have, not damp in a natural way, but saturated in a way that felt wrong if you've spent your life knowing how soil breathes. At first I told myself it was runoff from weather, maybe irrigation imbalance. Anything simple enough to avoid the conclusion I was starting to suspect. But then I noticed a faint chemical smell in the soil near the oldest trees, something that didn't belong there at all. That night I took samples, carefully labeled everything, GPS coordinates, timestamps, photos from multiple angles, because experience teaches you that if you don't document something immediately, it becomes easy for other people to dismiss later. A few days later, the lab results came back, and I remember sitting in my truck holding that report longer than I should have, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did, completely. And understanding something like that doesn't feel like information. It feels like a direction you can't stop once it starts moving. Chlorine levels detected in soil water where they should never have been, enough to disrupt microbial balance, enough to slowly destabilize what had taken decades to build, and suddenly the orchard didn't feel like something I was maintaining. It felt like something I was trying to protect from something already underway. And that was the moment I stopped thinking of it as a possibility and started thinking of it as a conflict I didn't choose, but was already inside. I called an attorney the next morning, because whatever this was becoming, it was no longer just about land. It was about whether something living could be quietly damaged while still being considered legally acceptable on paper, and whether that distinction would matter before it was too late. And that's where everything began to shift from uncertainty into something that would eventually bring both properties, and both versions of reality, into direct collision. The first thing my attorney told me was something I didn't want to hear, not because it was shocking, but because it was ordinary. He said, "This is going to come down to proof, not belief." And I remember just sitting there in his office, looking at a stack of folders that suddenly felt heavier than they should have. Because proof sounds simple until you realize how much work it takes to make invisible damage visible in a system that prefers clean lines and clear violations. His name was Garrett Monroe, an environmental land attorney who had seen enough of these kinds of disputes to stop reacting emotionally to them. And he listened to everything I had, the soil samples, the photos, the early test results, and when I finished, he didn't promise anything. He just leaned back and said, "If water is moving from his property to yours, and if you can tie contamination to that flow, then you have something. But you're going to need time, and you're going to need patience, because right now you're describing harm that doesn't show up dramatically enough for most people to care about quickly." That sentence stuck with me more than I expected, because it meant I wasn't just fighting a neighbor, I was fighting perception itself. Back at the orchard, the changes were getting harder to ignore. The lower rows of apple trees were the first to show stress, leaves losing their deep green color and shifting into something dull and uneven, fruit developing smaller than usual, not rotten, not dead, just wrong in a way that made your stomach tighten if you knew what they were supposed to look like. And I started spending more time there than I ever had before, not because I could fix anything in the moment, but because I didn't trust myself to look away. Every rainfall made it worse, not instantly, but gradually, like the land was absorbing something it couldn't process and then slowly giving up on trying. I took more samples, more photos, built a timeline that stretched from the first suspicious saturation event to the present, and I started marking patterns I didn't want to see, because the pattern was consistent, runoff from the ridge always showing up in the same lower zones, always following the same slope lines that pointed directly back toward Victor Hale's property. A week after I filed preliminary legal notice, I received a response from his legal team, short, clean, and written in the kind of language that feels like it was designed to remove human contact from responsibility. It said their drainage system was fully compliant with county regulations, that no direct causation had been established, and that any agricultural changes were likely due to external environmental variables. And I remember reading that last line twice because it felt like watching someone politely tell you your reality didn't qualify as evidence. Meanwhile, Victor's property didn't slow down at all. Construction was finished, and the house became something out of a lifestyle feature spread, all glass reflections, curated lighting, and weekend gatherings that made it look like nothing serious could ever exist in its shadow. And I remember standing in my orchard at night, sometimes looking up at the ridge lights, and thinking how strange it is that two places can exist so close together and yet feel like they belong to completely different versions of reality. Then came the invitation, an open house event, not addressed personally to me, but delivered through a printed card that felt almost theatrical in its wording, celebrating harmony between architecture and landscape. And I actually laughed when I read it, because at that point I had soil samples in my refrigerator and dying trees in my field, and the word harmony felt like a language mistake. Garrett told me not to engage emotionally, just keep documenting, because public exposure changes leverage even when legal systems move slowly, and that was when I decided to shift from quiet observation to visible record. I installed trail cameras along the boundary line, small and discreet, aimed at drainage paths and runoff points. And I placed simple signs at the edge of my property, nothing dramatic, just factual, stating that the orchard was under documented investigation for chemical contamination linked to adjacent development runoff, and I made sure they faced uphill, toward the ridge, where anyone visiting could see them clearly without having to be told. The day of the open house arrived with perfect weather, which somehow made everything feel more artificial, like nature itself was refusing to acknowledge what was happening underneath it. And I worked the orchard that morning in full view of the ridge, not to provoke anything, but because I wanted my presence to be part of the record too. Because land that is being affected deserves to be seen while it is still alive enough to speak for itself. Cars began arriving around midday, expensive vehicles lining the ridge road, and I could hear voices drifting down as guests toured the property above, and at first it was just distant noise. But then I noticed movement at the boundary fence. People walking closer, curious, reading the signs I had placed, looking down into the orchard with expressions that slowly shifted from casual interest to uncertainty. One woman asked if the orchard was part of the estate design, and I told her no. It had been here long before any of this was built, and I pointed toward the lower rows where the damage was most visible, and I said quietly, "That's where their drainage ends up." And I could feel the shift happen immediately, not loud, not dramatic, just a collective recalibration of what they thought they were looking at. Victor appeared on the upper terrace shortly after, and I could see him watching the group at the fence, then watching me. And for the first time, there was something less controlled in his posture, not panic, but awareness that the narrative was no longer contained within his property lines. His architect, Julian Cross, came down to the boundary first, trying to manage the situation with calm explanations about compliance and engineering approval. But the guests were no longer listening in the same way, because they could see the orchard, they could see the uneven color of the trees, they could see water patterns in the soil that didn't match the idea of no impact. When I finally spoke directly to Julian, I said, "Compliance doesn't stop consequences," and I didn't raise my voice, because I didn't need to. The land was doing the speaking for me. By the end of the afternoon, the open house didn't collapse in any dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no shouting, just something worse for Victor, which was doubt spreading quietly among the very people he had invited to admire perfection. And when the last guests left earlier than planned, I stood alone in the orchard again listening to the silence return, and I realized I hadn't won anything yet. But I had changed the visibility of the fight, and sometimes that is the first real turning point you get. That night, I reviewed the camera footage for the first time, frame by frame, and saw exactly what I expected, water movement tracing a consistent path from the ridge drainage outlet down into my orchard, subtle but undeniable when viewed over time, and I sent everything to Garrett immediately, because now it wasn't just suspicion or observation, it was documented causation. A few days later, the first article appeared online, framing the situation as a case of architectural oversight with environmental consequences, and then another followed, and another after that. And suddenly what had been a private dispute was starting to take shape as a public example of something larger, something people could understand even if they didn't know either of us personally. And that was when I realized the situation had crossed into a new phase entirely, one where control over the story mattered almost as much as control over the land, and the final resolution was now just a matter of time and pressure. The mediation room felt almost too ordinary for something that had carried so much weight. Beige walls, a long table, soft lighting, the kind of place designed for resolution, but not for the kind of consequences that had already played out in real soil, on real trees, over real months. I sat beside my attorney, David Langford, and watched Victor Hale arrive with his legal team. Same calm posture, same controlled expression, but now that calm felt less like confidence and more like something he was holding on to carefully, like it might slip if he stopped paying attention to it. David didn't start with emotion. He started with structure, laying everything out in sequence: soil analysis reports, runoff mapping, lab confirmations, rainfall correlation data, and with each document placed on the table, the story stopped being something I was living and became something everyone could trace visually from ridge to orchard. Victor's lawyer immediately went into the expected framework: county compliance, approved engineering, absence of direct causation. The language of legality designed to separate permission from outcome. But this time it didn't hold the same weight, because the physical pattern behind it was no longer in dispute. David finally spoke clearly and said, "We are dealing with verified chlorinated runoff originating from a permitted drainage system entering certified organic agricultural soil, resulting in documented biological disruption and loss of certification status." And after that sentence, the room didn't move for a moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was complete. There was nothing left to reinterpret. Victor leaned forward slightly and repeated what he had said before, that everything was built to code, fully inspected, fully approved, and that water moving downhill was a natural condition, not a controlled action. And I remember thinking how differently we were all defining responsibility in that moment. Because in his version it stopped at the property line, and in mine it followed the actual path of impact. I spoke once during the session, not to argue, just to state what had become undeniable, and I said, "It didn't cross your boundary, it came from your system." And the room didn't react outwardly, but the tone shifted slightly after that, because geography was no longer a convincing defense. The mediator then asked the question that actually mattered, not about intent, but about foreseeability, whether it was reasonable to expect that a downhill organic agricultural operation could be affected by chemically treated runoff from a large engineered pool drainage system. And that question moved everything away from argument and into responsibility. That's when Victor's architect, Marcus Ellery, finally spoke, and for the first time there was hesitation in his voice. He admitted that while the system met all county requirements and structural standards, it had never been evaluated for downstream agricultural sensitivity, especially not certified organic soil systems that depend on microbial balance. And that gap between compliance and environmental compatibility became impossible to ignore once it was spoken out loud. After that, the conversation changed pace completely, not because anyone rushed, but because resistance stopped being useful, and what remained was calculation, crop loss estimates, certification restoration costs, soil remediation projections, and long-term yield impact, all translated into financial terms that could fit into a settlement structure, even though none of it could truly represent what had been lost in reality. Victor's legal team still tried to frame everything around compliance and limitation of liability, but by then the discussion had already shifted, because compliance explains permission, not consequence, and consequence was what everyone was finally looking at directly. The settlement formed without any dramatic moment: $380,000 in damages, full responsibility for soil remediation, funding for organic certification restoration, and most importantly, a mandatory redesign of the entire drainage system so that no runoff from Victor's property could enter agricultural land below, meaning the system that caused the damage would not continue in its original form. When it was over, there was no celebration, no confrontation, just people standing, gathering papers, and leaving in the same quiet way they arrived. And Victor walked out without looking at me, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left in that space that required acknowledgement anymore. I stayed seated for a moment after everyone left, just letting it settle, because the strange part about outcomes like this is how ordinary they look compared to what they cost. There's no cinematic release, just pressure finally stopping after months of building. Outside, the air felt unchanged, but I wasn't unchanged in it, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about the next rainfall as a threat to everything I had built. Back at the orchard, nothing changed immediately. The trees were still damaged, the lower rows still showed stress, and that matters, because real resolution doesn't erase consequences. It only stops them from continuing, and recovery is something that has to happen slowly afterward, without ceremony. Over the following weeks, soil readings began to stabilize gradually, not suddenly, but enough to confirm the contamination source was gone, and engineers returned to the ridge to rebuild the drainage system properly this time, with containment, controlled diversion, and separation from any agricultural flow below. I went up once during reconstruction, not to confront anyone, just to see it. And it looked different even mid-build. because now every decision accounted for what existed downhill, not just what existed inside property lines. And standing there, I realized something that stayed with me longer than anything else, that most of these conflicts don't come from pure malice, but from systems that simply don't account for what they affect until someone forces them to. And by then the cost has already been paid somewhere else. I didn't feel the kind of satisfaction people expect from stories like this. No dramatic revenge, no perfect closure, just a quiet understanding that the damage had stopped spreading. And in farming, sometimes that is the only kind of win that actually matters. And even now I still think about how easily it could have stayed fully compliant, on paper, while quietly destroying something living underneath. And I wonder how many other places are sitting in that same invisible gap between legality and reality right now. So I'll leave you with this question. If you were in my position and saw the first signs of contamination reaching your land, would you wait for the system to respond, or would you force visibility immediately the way I did? Because I still don't think there's a perfect answer, only the one you can live with afterward.